I'm Peter Austin, that is a pack of cards, and this is interesting. Most of us are very familiar indeed with the contents of a standard deck of 52 playing cards. 4 suits containing an ace, the numbers 2 to 10 and 3 face cards, or court cards. However, depending on how much you tend to focus on the game you're playing when holding a handful of these things, you might not actually have noticed that those face cards vary quite significantly in their design from one suit to the next. Or even if you were aware that they aren't totally homogeneous, you might not actually know what exactly it is that sets each one apart. Add to that the unexpected reason why the Ace of Spades is so ornate, and there's really quite a lot to unpack, no pun intended, when it comes to a pack of 52 cards. So today I'll be walking you through some of the most interesting features that can be found amongst the deck, giving you the lowdown on why the King of Hearts might be the strangest face card of them all, and explaining why a man was actually put to death for printing one of those ornate Ace of Spades designs that we're so familiar with today. Here are the overlooked details of playing card designs. The images we see today in most decks of so-called English pattern cards derive from a style that originated in Rouen, France, first exported to England in the late 15th century. This French set grew to be very popular with Brits in the coming decades, to the point that they started to produce their own copies, and in 1628 a ban was actually placed on the importation of foreign decks in order to support those English manufacturers. The problem was, though, that in those days, packs of cards were created by manually printing with wooden blocks into which the designs were carved. And so, through a combination of misinterpretation, artistic license, and just plain poor craftsmanship, those original French designs ended up gradually changing over hundreds of years, and sometimes in rather distorted ways. You see, most cards, like the Queen of Diamonds for example, depict their subject at an oblique angle, with their face in pretty much full view. However, the Jacks of Spades and Hearts, as well as the King of Diamonds, show their faces in profile. Now this is because originally the subjects of these particular cards were depicted from the back, with their head looking over their shoulder and their arms emerging in the background from behind their torsos. Today though, while this perspective does partially survive if you look at it the right way, they definitely have a rather awkward and unnatural appearance, which is partly evidenced by variants like this where there's confusion even about which hand is supposed to be visible and how it's oriented. I mean, look at the Jack of Hearts and make it make sense. If we are facing his back and he's got his head over his left shoulder like this, then the hand that's up here holding the feather is his right hand reaching across his body, which means the hand holding the axe over there is his left hand also reaching across his body, which is not dangerous at all, especially when you have the blade aimed at your head. And this brings us to a particularly curious detail, one that's been staring you in the face your whole life, but that you might not have noticed until now. Somehow, against all probability, it appears that nearly every royal in the pack is left-handed. Admittedly, with the one-eyed cards, this is partly based on inference. In the case of the King of Diamonds, there's some variation from one manufacturer to the next, but most designs depict his free hand as being a right one, suggesting he must be holding his weapon with his left hand. Incidentally, this is the only king who carries an axe rather than a sword. The same is true of the Jack of Hearts, as we've just seen, who almost always holds that feather in his right hand, meaning the axe must be in his left. But even if you find these examples a bit of a reach, or at least inconclusive, it couldn't be clearer with those two-eyed royals at that oblique angle. The Jack of Clubs clearly holds his weapon in his left hand, as does the King, who, despite being the only face card to have been honoured with a ceremonial orb, seems so averse to using his right hand in fact, that the thing just sort of hovers in mid-air below his right shoulder. The King of Spades, the only king to face to the right, also grips a sword in his left hand. And while most of the queens hold their flowers on the right, suggesting this might be their dominant side, the Queen of Hearts bucks that trend, and the Queen of Spades, who's the only one to also hold a sort of scepter, grips that in her left. Now, one would assume that of the two items, she'd probably want to hold the staff on her dominant side and the flower in the other, suggesting she too favours the devil's hand. It's alright, I'm allowed to say that because so do I. I'm a card-carrying member, you might say. Last but not least, we have the King of Hearts. Now, he also holds his sword in his left hand, but I'm still leaning towards him being right-handed nonetheless. The reason being that that left hand doesn't appear to be maintaining a great deal of control over his weapon, buried as it is in the side of his head. What has happened here? In fact, the King of Hearts is sometimes known by a nickname that refers to this apparent self-inflicted act of violence, although I'm probably not allowed to say it out loud on YouTube if I want to be able to pay my bills next month. Now, the first thing I have to point out about this isn't particularly exciting, which is that this is actually just an optical illusion. In reality, his weapon is simply raised up into the air over his shoulder, with the blade disappearing behind his head due to the perspective. But there is a bit more going on here. You see, it's because of this pose that he even has a sword today. Originally, he carried an axe like the King of Diamonds, but with most of the blade being hidden behind his head, this is another detail that was lost in the process of reproduction over hundreds of years, with printmakers eventually turning it into a sword by adding the hilt we see in most versions today. But while we may now have concluded that the King of Hearts' sword-waving habits were not nearly as deadly as they first seemed, the same can't be said for that most ornate of cards, the Ace of Spades, which has one confirmed kill on its record. You see, thanks to Queen Anne, from 1711 right up until 1960, card manufacturers used to have to pay stamp duty on their decks. This was essentially a moral tax on gambling in order to bolster the treasury. Properly licensed and taxed decks were marked by an official Ace of Spades card, a card that was actually produced off-site under the country's stamp commissioner and then sent to the manufacturer to insert into their packs of the 51 other cards that they'd made themselves. And this is why the traditional Ace of Spades is so ornate. Rather than existing to merely make the deck look nice or provide a place for the manufacturer to stick their brand, its main purpose is to be difficult to forge. But that didn't stop a man called Richard Harding, born 1770, who in 1805 was convicted of manufacturing his own brass stamps in the style of the Stamp Commissioner's Ace of Spades, officially called the duty card, and selling untaxed packs containing those fake aces. These were capital offences at the time, and so Harding was sentenced to death for his crimes, all thanks to a dodgy Ace of Spades. Nice cheery ending for you. Remember, if you'd like to support this channel where I talk about such algorithm-friendly topics as execution and sword wounds to the head, you can leave me a tip at the link pinned below, or even sign up for monthly support if you'd like. I promise not to gamble a single penny of it at the card table, alright? Go fish. I've been Peter Austin, and that was interesting. Oh, and look, a video all about all the other ridiculous things you could be hanged for in the 1700s. Go give that a watch now.